talks lined up over the summer, which we've advertised around. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Geoffrey to give tonight's talk. Geoffrey's a PhD from the University of Cambridge. He's now jointly between the University of Leicester and here the Centre of Arts and Humanities Research, which is a fairly new, I think, well, it's been a few years old now, but a fairly new initiative from the museum to develop the research angles within the library and archives and the humanities side of the museum's work. So that's really looking forward to that. So over to you, Geoffrey, and catch up later for some questions.
Great. Well, thank you everyone for coming. There's a bit of, maybe not a lie, but there's lots of science in my title, in my abstract, but very little science in the talk today. We'll be talking about, I am a historian of science, working at the University of Leicester and in the Centre for Arts and Humanities Research. And what I'm doing is working on a very large AHRC-funded science and culture project called, this is a long title, get ready, Constructing Scientific Communities, Citizen Science in the 19th and 21st Centuries. And what we're doing really is trying to understand what it means to participate in science, both in a historical perspective through the understanding of participation in science in periodicals, which is what I do as a historian, and understanding more contemporary participation in science through citizen science, and seeing how we can think about a corollary between 21st and 19th century participation in science. So what I want to do today is give you a bit of an overview. The presentation is going to do, well, a couple of things. Hopefully the first thing is not bore you to bits, but to intrigue you about what the value of citizen science and periodicals is. But more particularly, I want to give first a qualitative case study of how studying a set of images, so a set of illustrations in a couple of periodicals, can give insight into how practitioners of science, or practitioners particularly of natural history, as we are in the Natural History Museum, were participating in science through the Victorian periodical. And then I also want to give some initial details into how we, as a project, are looking to the use of citizen scientists themselves through the Zooniverse platform, which I'll talk about a little bit about later, to create quantitative data on the production and reproduction of images across a set of periodicals. And really what the goal of my research in total is to think about how participation in science is both an active and a historical category. It's something that's working both in a modern period and in a historical period. So what exactly is this Constructing Scientific Communities, or I'm not going to say the full title anymore, but ConSciComm. We have conscicom.org if you want more information on the project as a whole and all of the various participants across 5 institutions in the UK. Well, I am one postdoc of 3 working on the history of periodicals in the 19th century. And the goal is really to do a critical investigation of the participation of the non-professional naturalist through the periodical. I have a colleague at the University of Oxford who's doing this, but for medical practitioners. So I'm looking at the naturalist and natural history and how they're participating through the periodical. And really the goal is to better understand the roots of citizen science. And I'll come to this idea or term of citizen science in a second. We also want to use the 21st century citizen science to actually do historical research for us on periodicals. So in a certain sense, this is crowdsourced history. And for my particular research, I am going to argue at the end of my 3.5-year postdoc that the illustrations, the use of illustrations, the production and the reproduction of illustrations in all sorts of natural history periodicals in the 19th century are really is a key way to answering these sets of questions about how people participated in science. Now this brings up a set of problematics, which many of you may be thinking already. Is, well, what is this term citizen science? And well, citizen scientist is a very modern term. It's really been only developed over the last 30 or so years and put into practice very specifically through projects like Zooniverse. It's not really, or it's not at all, a historical category. So why are historians starting to use a term like citizen scientist to apply it backwards? And for a historian, there's really a risk of being what's called presentist or ahistorical, trying to put a category back onto the 19th century. But what I'm hoping to do a bit in this presentation is show you that by thinking about citizen scientist or the non-professional, whatever terms we're going to start using, and using citizen science platforms or crowdsourced history, they can be mutually beneficial. We can start to think of a crossover. And they can help us think about both the non-professional participation in 19th century science, as well as developing tools for understanding citizen science research itself, modern citizen science. Or a better term for what we're doing maybe is citizen humanities. Maybe we're not scientists at all, and we're citizen humanists. So rather, the rest of this talk is going to give 2 periodical case studies and a description of our new Citizen Humanities website, or how we're using citizen scientists in action. So, to the first periodical, Hardwicks Science Gossip. Anybody heard of this periodical before? Well, you will now have a chance to actually look at it. This is from the Library and Archives, so do what you will with it. Pass it around. Be sure to take particular interest in all of the range and sorts of illustrations which come to you page after page. There is also a bookmark I've put in there, and please try not to lose the bookmark, but pay particular attention to the top left-hand corner where it talks about the establishment of a new society, and I'm going to come back to that in the latter half of this talk. So, what is Hardwicks Science Gossip, or more generally known as Science Gossip? Well, it's a large genre, or a broad genre, natural history periodical running between 1865 and about 1902. It's a periodical that's really looking to collect all natural history knowledge of what we would consider amateur naturalists in the 19th century. Now, this category of amateur or professional naturalists is really a very blurred category, much as this in the same way as it is today. But this periodical is looking to collect anyone who likes to go out and look at stuff in nature and collect it and talk about it and maybe exchange it with other people. It was printed and published by a fairly well-known publisher by the name of Robert Hardwick, and printed by a fairly common printer called Wyman & Sons of London. And had really over a 15-year period, which is the period I look at, 65 to 79, 2 primary editors. And these 2 editors were Mordecai Cubitt Cook, who was a fairly well-known mycologist, studying really mushrooms and how they bloomed in their reproduction. And later in 1872 to 95, a geologist by the name of John Eller Taylor. Okay. So, what is Science Gossip trying to do? Well, really, it's trying to, their real main aim is the circulation of knowledge, that the periodical is a way to circulate knowledge. And this is from one of their prefaces, which is really a goldmine for historians, because it's editors talking about what they want their periodical to do. And they say, we stand between the high priests of pure science and the humbler votaries who would know its wisdom, the amateurs. Our ambition is not to be esteemed learned, not a learned society, so much as to be deemed useful. A really essential term here, useful versus learned. By uniting in monthly fellowship, the unassuming but ardent lovers of nature, we feel we are doing much good by giving them means of noting phenomenon worth notice, comparing notes, and in relieving each other's difficulties. We are helping on that reign of goodwill towards men, which this especial season brings to mind. This especial season is always written at the Christmas period, right? So joyful tidings about going and collecting in nature, wonderful things that you can do through a periodical. So really, the periodical here is a place to gather people. It's a place where knowledge can be exchanged, things can be sent in, new information can be gathered. And really, illustration, what I want to argue for the rest of this, becomes an essential role in this. It becomes a way in which many authors and many unknown authors, many naturalists, amateur naturalists, are able to participate in a really wide network of Victorian science. So, it begs the question of what did authorship and illustration in the journal, in this particular journal, actually look like? Well, between 1865 and 1877, about a 12-year period, I did a quantitative study as a historian. This is a wonderful thing, doing actual quantitative stuff. Sounds a bit more scientific, but in the 12-year period, there's 471 named authors. There's no particular names of note except for a couple. Alfred Russel Wallace gives in 1 or 2 articles to the periodical. Thomas Henry Huxley, who many of you know as Darwin's bulldog, has 1 article but fairly small. And a French zoologist by the name of Poitrefage also has an article. But everyone else is entirely unknown, or at least unknown to the annals of history. They're not people that come down as important dogmatic scientists of the 19th century. So this is a treasure trove for thinking about who the non-professional is, who the amateur is. And over this 12-year period, they produce 2,341 articles, 41 individual written articles. 690 of these articles, a fairly large percentage, were illustrated, producing 3,643 reproduced illustrations under 2,689 different number figures. And it looks something like this. This is the distribution of illustrations over this 13-volume period. And now they're separated out into 3 different lines here, because this is how when you're looking at a periodical, an illustration is not just a singular image on a page. Sometimes they'll be split and made into different ways. And thinking about trying to understand how they're made and reproduced matters, at least for historians of the image. So the blue line here will be plates, or supposed plates of illustrations, so grouped together images on a page, and that will help us think about, well, how many different engravers did the periodical rely on? How many different actual physical wooden plates did they have to build in order to reproduce an image? The number of figures, the red line here, will designate how the editor of the journal, or how the journal itself, through the editor, started to define what was different between an illustration, because this is how they would start numbering them, sequentially from 1 to 350 through a periodical. And then the total number of illustrations will be a group between these. What doing this, at least as a historian does, is it tells us a couple of interesting things. First, it tells us just how often a periodical was illustrated. Instead of just saying something anecdotally about, it's illustrated very well, we can say something a bit more numerically. But it also tells us something about what changes between editors. So this fairly odd spike you see in volume 7 and 8 is actually when they have a changeover between Mordecai Cubitt Cook and John Eller Taylor. So when you change over the hands of the people doing or reproducing the periodical, it changes the content and changes what kind of information is communicated through this venue. So there's an interesting corollary here. Also, interestingly, within this, there is a much smaller degree, while there's a large number of authors, there's a much smaller number of engravers. So there's really, over this 12-year period, only 38 listed engravers, people that actually put their name to an illustration as the person taking it from a drawing into an engraved plate. But even more interestingly, 95% of all illustrations that have a name on it only have one name on it, and that's George W. Ruffle. So obviously the journal's relying on one person to do most of their reproduction. So it brings up really interesting questions about where authorship lies. Is it between the author of the article, which is sometimes different than the person giving the illustration, or is it the intermediary between the person that has to change the illustration into a printed image? And it's different from, or what we'll see is different from another periodical, which is the Queckett Society Journal, which I'll talk about in a minute. And as you're looking through Science Gossip, you can see the foundation of the society itself. But before turning to Queckett, I want to look at how images turn into illustrations themselves in a periodical such as Science Gossip. So how do you move from a drawing to a print, and what kind of erasures happen when that occurs? So this is a really fantastic find that the wonderful people in the archives, in the library and archives, helped give to me while working in CAHR. So this is a scrapbook of illustrations made and reproduced in Science Gossip. We have no idea how it came to the archives, or at least I don't know yet. But it's a group of a fairly randomized illustration. It doesn't start at the start of the volume and end at the end of what would have been a number of different volumes, but it's just whatever they had pieced together. And what we see here is a set of drawings given for an article by an Irish intellectual by the name of G.H. Kinahan, who was a member of the Royal Irish Academy. And he sent this in order to reproduce this article in Hardwicks Science Gossip in 1867, I believe. And he sends this article in order to tell about recent and interesting burns that he had found in the Irish countryside, and he sent down illustrations. The illustrations, interestingly, if we look a bit closer, can tell us something about the fact that it's not just Kinahan that's the author here. He includes the name of the artist who made these illustrations, E.J. Hardman, and you see that here as well, E.J.H., right? So when you look at the actual original drawing, you can see that there's multiple modes of authorship. There's multiple people contributing to the knowledge that would then come into science gossip. But let's look a little bit closer at the journal. Sorry. The problem of a clicker. There we go. Okay. So let's look a little bit closer. And you see that there is a significant erasure here. Not only is the background of the image taken away. Sorry, this one is this here. So we don't have some detail that's in the original drawing. But most importantly, you don't have the author of the image itself, right? So the only author you have here is G.H. Kinahan. So it becomes a different value of who is doing and who's contributing this knowledge through the periodical. So importantly, the periodical changes the information. It remakes it, right? Also, interestingly for historians of illustration, is there's a split, or the image itself, how it's constructed on the page, is changed. Well, the images sent in, obviously these are paired images, and they're paired here as well, but they're shifted in their physical construction, how they're read. So trying to figure out how an image is read in its original intention, how it's read in a periodical, helps shift that knowledge, how it's made and how it is remade. Right. So, as promised, let's move on to the second periodical. Does anybody know the Queckett Society? All right. Anybody a member of the Queckett Society? It'd be great. Awesome. Maybe we can talk later because I really want to visit. The Queckett Society is whoever has the science gossip at the moment. This is a society for microscopical science dedicated for amateurs. Which was established in the fall of 1865. And the very interesting part about it, well, other than the fact that it's established in 1865 and is still active and running, but more importantly for a historian and periodical, or maybe not more importantly, but equally important, is that it was not just established by a set of amateurs, but it was established through science gossip. So it's it's a community gathering in science gossip, and then creates another smaller community or a more focused community through the periodical. So they send in letters that are then printed in science gossip, and they make the society through this. It was established in fall of 1865 in honor of John Queckett, who was a histologist and fairly well-known and beloved microscopist. He was the assistant curator of the Royal College of Surgeons, and he worked fairly specifically under the thumb of Richard Owen, who many of you will know as one of the progenitors or the progenitor of the Natural History Museum. Before he came here, he was one of the directors at the Royal College of Surgeons. Not always the nicest of guys. John Queckett dies at 46 years old in 1861, and the Queckett Society really establishes itself in order to honor his legacy, but also specifically to bring together anyone interested in microscopy. What it consists of is monthly meetings in London, demonstrations, slide exchanges, and a couple of years later, starting in 1868, the publication of a journal. What becomes this? The Journal of the Queckett Microscopical Society, or the Queckett Microscopical Club. And the point of the journal is in order to reproduce demonstrations which occurred during the meetings. So it's about going to a meeting, giving a talk, and then that becoming something which is printed later. But also just giving information about what is happening in the society, who is participating, how much money is coming in, how much money is going out. Right. This is a copy. Also, Library and Archives is a copy of the Queckett. Pay attention to the different physical layout because these things matter. Most importantly, I've put a bookmark into one of the illustrations, which I'll be talking about in a minute. So, the Queckett Society establishes itself in 1865 and then its journal in 1867. And it's important to identify why you're looking at one particular journal and one particular subset of natural history. And microscopy begs a certain concern, or it allows for a certain investigation into natural history. First of all, because in different ways than other subsets of natural history, such as geology or botany or zoology, it relies very particularly on drawing, on a skill set of drawing, and a skill set of vision, being able to observe in a specific way through a technology of observation, and then being able to draw that. So it relies on illustration in a very explicit way. That's not to say that other genres or other disciplines in natural history don't do that as well, but they do it in a different way. There's an explicit way in which microscopy relies on this. And it also has a very specific relationship to the amateur, especially in the 19th century. And this is quite clear, as it still does today, that to do microscopical science is also to be an amateur. There is no professor of microscopy in the 19th century. This is very largely, and has historically, since Hooke's Micrographia in the 17th century, been an amateur pursuit. So it's a very interesting subject to start thinking about the amateur and thinking about illustration in the 19th century. The audience of the journal itself is also quite interesting. It's explicitly the members of the journal itself, right? So if you are a member of the member of the club itself, you get a copy of the journal. So it's much more contained and self-reflexive journal than Science Gossip is. And both the club and the journal focuses on the student, very explicitly, the student and the amateur microscopist. That is their goal, that is their community, that's the people they want to speak to, and that's how they construct both the language of their journal and their images. But producing a journal, even for the Microscopical Society, which is supposed to be cohesive, is not always. This is a letter to the editor from The Lancet. Has anybody heard of The Lancet? Right, very famous, still a running medical journal. And we'll talk about this in a minute. One of the most interesting things about the Queckett Society is that it's largely containing doctors, people that are doing medical practice. So this is a very important place for them to be writing about the Queckett Society. And in 1868, you get this really wonderful letter, and I'm going to read it in full because it's so interesting. We observe by some 24 pages of printed matter which has reached us that the Queckett Microscopical Society has rushed into print. We cannot but regret this. As calculated, it seems to us to defeat the very object for which the club was established, viz., to secure the means of intercommunication between amateur naturalists and microscopists. It then goes on, we are very much mistaken if this very desirable state of things will not soon be altered, now that everything spoken may be put into print, and virtually the papers and discussions printed will come from a limited number of members. Again, a little bit farther down, on the back of the cover of this first number of the Transactions is an advertisement of the club, which states that it was established in 1865 for the purpose of affording to experienced microscopists as well as to students regular and frequent opportunities of discussing those special subjects in which they are interested. And the real attack comes right at the end. It says, what? To experienced microscopists? ? If the Queckett Club will only carry out its original intention of making its meetings partake more of the nature of a science gossip, again referring back to where it started, it will continue one of the most popular societies of the day. But we have little hesitation in taking an adverse view of the matters if it seeks to run in the same groove as its royal superior. Right? So really here is real contention about the value and meaning of a journal. They don't want to be the Royal Microscopical. It's not the Royal Society they're referring to here, because that's even more highfalutin than what they want their society to be about. They don't want their society to turn into the Royal Microscopical Society journal. Right? So they want it to be about amateurs coming together and coming together in person. Print changes everything. Right. So if we're looking at what let me just say two things. So what this quote does is it does two things. It shows that the club would rather keep that it would like to keep it explicitly casual, i.e. that the meetings it's at meetings not in print that retains the culture of a science gossip, and it also balks against the idea that a journal was for the experienced microscopist, right? So here again is the idea of the amateur being the essential aspect of the periodical. So you need, as a historian, you need to dig a little bit deeper. What exactly are the professional or amateur affiliations which are participating both in the journal and in the society itself? By looking at affiliation, and how we get to affiliation is by studying how people identify themselves in the journal, and wonderfully, at the end of each journal, they also include a list of all society members. And within that, if you wanted to, you could have given your FRAS or your FRS or whatnot. So it gives us some idea of who is participating and what other societies and learned societies they're participating in. And you need to understand what it meant to be an amateur or what it meant to be a professional in the period and where this divide really lies. And I think one way of understanding that is looking at the society and professional affiliations. It's not exclusive because it's a certain bias, but at least it gives us some idea. So this is what it looks like. Of the 753 members over an 11-year period between 1867 and 1878, there's 753 members. 515 of these, the greatest majority, had absolutely no affiliation. So they weren't members of any other society and never gave themselves a designation as being another society. 283 individuals had one kind of affiliation to one set of societies, and of those, 176 more had at least one affiliation, so had two or more affiliations to different societies in London. All that's well and good, but you need to understand what exactly these societies are. Well, this is a grand list of all the societies that were participating in the Queckett Society and the journal between 1867 and 1878. So what are they? Well, you have only about 10 that are members of the Queckett Committee itself, so giving themselves a title of president or vice president or librarian curator. Interestingly, the curator is George W. Ruffle. If anyone will remember who that person was, is the engraver for Science Gossip. So obviously there's a community overlap between these people. The greatest majority of affiliations is to the, well, not quite obviously, is the Royal Microscopical Society. So you have what people would define themselves. If we're going to say that a Royal Society is where professional scientists or professional microscopists gather, then these two then there's a lot of overlap between the professional and the amateur in these societies. But also, wonderfully, you have a fairly large remit of the other Royal Societies, the Linnean, the Zoological Society, the Royal Astronomical Society, the Royal Society. But then the second largest set or groups of people are someone with either a doctor before their name, an MRCS, which is a member of the Royal College of Surgeons, or an FRCS, which is a fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons. So meaning that they practice, or sorry, of the Royal College of Physicians. So either they practice some kind of medicine or surgery in the 19th century and were participating in the periodical and in the Queckett Society through this affiliation. What this begs is a really interesting, or what it puts forward, is an idea that there's a fairly wide range of affiliations and a fairly wide range of professionalisms that are participating in the society. So when we think about what it means to be an amateur, what it means to be a professional, you need to think about, well, in what particular way are they trying to be professional? And does an attribution of professional in another field, such as medicine, give credence to a professionalism or a greater authority in something like microscopy, because there's such an overlap, particularly in histology, to using the microscope to do medicine, right? So is there an overlap? Okay. Let's look a little bit closer at the distribution of images. So if we have a distribution of authorship or of professional affiliations, what do the illustrations actually look like in this periodical? So the structure of the Queckett Microscopical Society is, as you will be passing it around, very different from Science Gossip. It has a very different organization of articles. So this is an analysis of all illustrations and articles in the Queckett Society between this period, 667 and 1878. And you'll see that really, when you're reading through each issue, that it's always similar, and there's a fairly typecast type of article and illustration. So you will have a number of articles without named authors. Most of the articles will have a named authorship, and then right at the end you'll have a set of articles, or what we could call articles, which are just about meetings, about descriptions of the meetings, and we could give an authorship to those. Say the president of the society puts his name to it and gives a description of it. So really, the greatest majority of this periodical is meeting notes, is minutes of meetings, really. Much smaller percentage is the illustrations and articles that are unillustrated themselves. So let's look at this distribution in a different way. So over this period, 66 to 77, there's just over 350 total articles, including all three of these subsets. Of these, the vast majority are not illustrated, not having an engraved plate, not having any kind of woodcut included in them. But there's at least over 55 to 60 articles which are illustrated. So unlike science gossip, it's not quite as regularly illustrated, but there's still a propensity. It's still, you can't really go through an issue without finding an illustration. So it's regularly but not massively illustrated. Right. So let's break this down just a little bit farther into thinking about authorship. So if you analyze all of the illustrations that happened over this 11-year period, you find that there's 368 separate articles, 61 of which have illustrations, but of those 61 articles, there's only 33 individual authors in the total year period that send in an illustration or set of illustrations. And by breaking this down, there's quite an obvious bias to one particular or set of authors, really. So if you think about the journal itself, it's mostly illustrated by one author, Mordecai Cubitt Cook, who, again, is the editor and contributor for Science Gossip, and one of the founding members for the Queckett Society, right? So the other point is you can't really think about a journal like the Queckett Society without thinking about Science Gossip. Right? There is even though they're completely distinct and separate journals, that there is a distinct overlap in how the knowledge is constructed in the periodical, and especially how the knowledge is constructed through the illustrations. So Cook, as I explained, is a very well-known mycologist. He is an editor of known repute. He is a committee member for the Queckett Society, so he gets privilege of place in the periodical. When he sends something in, it gets published, and when he sends an article in, it's highly illustrated. So this is the blue line here is how many articles. So it's just about 10 to 11 articles that he sends in over the period. But of those articles, there's over 135 illustrations, right? So his articles obviously are very highly illustrated. So this would then give the obvious point of the next thing I'm going to do is talk about how Cubitt Cook illustrated or used illustration. Let's do a case study of how Cook used illustration in this. But actually, that's not what I want to do. What I want to do is focus on the underdog here, B.T. Lown, who really only had one illustration from one article in the entire period of the 1866 to 78 that I'm looking at. But the interesting thing is that if you look at Lown's use and placement of his illustrations, it really tells an entirely different story of authorship than for someone like Cubitt Cook, right? And why is that? Well, why Lown in the first place? Well, Benjamin Thompson Lown is his full name, is explicitly an amateur, defines himself as an amateur microscopist. This is really the only biographical information I can find about him. He is a medical doctor. He's a member of the Royal College of Surgeons, practiced at St. Bart's, which is one of the famous London, really where you cut your teeth as a doctor in the 19th century. And he has this other Lown right underneath him, who is his son. And I'm not going to talk about him. It's very interesting that his son actually participates much more explicitly in the Queckett Society. But we know that this article is not by the Lown the Younger, because he doesn't join the Queckett Society until a number of years after the publication of this article, of his first article and his first illustration by Benjamin Thompson Lown. So, again, why Lown? Lown is interesting because he defines himself as an amateur, or at least within the journal, he's defined as an amateur. He really only has this affiliation as a medical practitioner, but nothing else. He's not a member of any other Royal Societies. He really doesn't contribute in any other way. And when he comes to the journal, it is after having recently come to the society itself. So he joins in 1868 and publishes for the first time in 1868. And really, over the next year or two, he gets to publish again a couple of times. He only has about 4 articles in total, but this is the only there's only one article which is illustrated. So let's look at that illustration. Who has the journal as a right? So if you open up to the bookmark page, we'll find the illustration itself. So what's interesting? Why again? It begs the question of why focus on Lown. Well, we're focusing on Lown because of a spatial demand or an organizational demand. So if you were a member of the society to open up your first volume of the Queckett Society Journal, the first image you would see is Lown's frontispiece, sitting right there on the 3rd page of the book. And this is interesting because the article and Lown himself doesn't come until about the 3rd half of the book, or the periodical itself. So he's not really publishing until much later in the year, but his illustration is taken out and repositioned as the first illustration in the book. So it's given a privileging of place. There's a separation of this article from the text. Right, so he only joined the periodical just earlier that year in 1868. Again, if we look at the illustration itself, we can tell a multiple sense of authorship here. So at the bottom, we see that it was drawn by Del Nat B.T. Lown, but that it was engraved or made into a lithograph by W.T. Suffolk. And that, again, there is an imprinter, or the person that's printing it is W. West. So to a certain degree, there's a different set of interveners in this image, right? So this isn't just Lown sitting at his microscope looking down and drawing what becomes the proboscis of a blowfly, and then it becomes natural public knowledge to all other microscopists. It goes through a series of replications and translations. And the interesting thing is that each of these individual authors are also members of the Queckett Society. So this is an internal matter. And each of these authors hold different values of authorship, or hold different professional values. So Suffolk himself, the lithographer, I should really learn how to use these next time. Okay, so Suffolk himself is both a lithographer and a fellow of the Royal Microscopical Society, and fairly immediately after this gives a series of very popular lectures to the Queckett Society on microscopical manipulations in the 1870s, which then get reproduced in various different locations. So Suffolk himself is not just a lithographer, but is someone that has his own set of knowledge practices and brings that to the reproduction. W. West is also a member of the society, but from 1865. So he is one of the founding members of the journal and the society itself. Right. So the multiple names and multiple authorships really points to a complicated relationship in authorship and trust in the reproduction of these images. So there's an idea in the history of science called the invisible technician, which is the person behind the scenes, which gets erased in publication or through science. But that's not really what's going on here. It's not the invisible technician, but this was all done as society publication. So this is society authorship, right? So even though the article itself is published by or produced by Lown, there's a set of different types of authorship. There's a set of different types of expertise. And we can see that. We can see the value of the image being undermined to a certain degree when you're given the description of the plate. So Lown writes, "The plate represents the dorsal aspect of the fly's proboscis mounted in balsam without pressure." So it's important to tell the reader how it's made in the first place. "Magnified about 40 diameters." You need to know how much magnification in order to look and see this yourself. And is intended to show the relations of the several parts. The lips are more inflated than it's natural during a life. Than is natural during life, a result which cannot be avoided in preparations like that from which the accompanying plate is taken. The important point to remember here is that this article, this quote, and this illustration all come from a society meeting in the first place and a demonstration of looking at the proboscis of the fly in person. Right? So the anxiety which Lown is putting forward here is that the illustration and the actual microscopic slide are not necessarily going to give you absolute proof. Right? It's not always perfect, but that the author needs to show you that, and that the illustration is not always perfect. Okay, how are we doing for time? Right, now on to science gossip.
15 minutes.
Sorry?
10, 15 minutes.
10, 15 minutes, great. Enough time to tell you why we go from science gossip to science gossip. That's what I should have named the title of the talk in the first place. From science gossip to science gossip. So, science gossip is the title of our citizen science Zooniverse platform that we've developed with Zooniverse, which is really one of the premier citizen science, digital science platforms out there right now. They've been going for just under 10 years, and I think right now they have about 33 citizen science different projects, ranging from astrophysics down to the minutiae of illustrations in periodicals. And this is a digital platform which has come through the collaboration with constructing scientific communities, but really came from the Biodiversity Heritage Library proposing a really amazing collaboration. So what the Biodiversity Heritage Library has digitized pretty much everything, well, so far, lots of things that naturalists and historians of natural history want to look at, both in the 19th century and the 18th century and the 20th century, really. So they have a whole range of periodicals that I'm looking at. And they proposed that they have no way of knowing how often illustrations occur within the pages of both their books and their periodicals, and that it would be useful to use citizen scientists to create metadata for that. So the ConSciComm, BHL, and Zooniverse have created Science Gossip as a solution to this, and we'll see down the line whether or not there is a solution to that. But so far, we've been doing pretty well. It's been going for about 2 months, so it's www.sciencegossip.org if anybody hasn't already come and played around with our website, which is wonderful. And under 2 months, in just over 2 months, or just under 2 months, we've had 185 different page classifications by just shy of 4,000 users. So these are 4,000 different individuals going through one page at a time and giving us different types of metadata. And I'll tell you why that matters to the kind of research I'm doing in a second, and why that matters really to digital humanities and to something like the BHL in the first place. So anyways, go and increase these numbers for us by playing around with sciencegossip.org over the next coming days. Okay, so what exactly are we doing so far on sciencegossip.org? Well, we have up there a set of runs of 5 periodicals, which we'll soon be adding more as soon as we're about 24% through this catch of periodicals. And some of the names will be familiar to you. The Science Gossip was one of the first ones with eponymous title that we've taken the name of our website. As well as other fairly well-known, at least in the period, interesting natural history periodicals. Intellectual Observer is like Science Gossip in that it's trying to bring together a wide range of students of natural history, and it's particularly illustrated. But like the Queckett Society, it's illustrated much more exclusively through plates than you would get through associated wood engravings on a page. So there's interesting things we can say about that. The Magazine of Natural History is really a wonderful journal that was started in the 1820s and ran for about 15 years under a various number of titles by the landscape gardener and fellow of the Linnaean Society, John Claudius Loudon, who is really a fascinating character. But the periodical itself is illustrated in a very interestingly different, an earlier 19th century period way. So we're getting our users to do that. And as well, we've got 2 more local society journals. So the Wiltshire Archaeological and Natural History magazine is an aim to look at how locals or a society journal from a particular geographical area in London, or sorry, in England, helps or creates a journal and how that changes the way illustrations are used and how they use illustration and how they use a periodical to communicate much more local and specific knowledge. And then finally, a very different type of journal, or a very different type of society journal, the Quarterly Journal of the Geological Society of London, which is a much larger society and has a much larger remit. So the goal is to be able to say something about all of these journals, and then be able to say something about illustrations across these journals, and whether or not that can tell us anything about participation, about lay participation, amateur citizen scientist participation. And the very fascinating thing is that we're using citizen scientists, modern citizen scientists, to understand their very roots. So how we can think about being a citizen scientist in the 19th century. So it's the first Zooniverse platform where people are actually doing that, being both citizen scientists and historical scientists. So what are you asked to do on this page, and why does it matter? Well, you're really 6 different things you're asked to do. The first thing is there an illustration on the page at all? And sometimes there isn't. Actually, a lot of them there isn't. And they tried to create an algorithm to completely eliminate all pages without illustration. But one of the things Zooniverse and citizen scientists generally have said is that the human's much better at this than a computer. So if the human it's not such a laborious task to just say, no, there's no illustration on the page, why not use that, than an algorithm. So if there is an illustration on the page, then they're asked to do a number of other things. If there's not, then they go on to the next page. So the first thing they're asked to do is draw boxes around the illustration. And this will help identify explicitly for BHL where illustrations are both on particular pages, but where they occur on a page, and how many are on a page, and being able to then distinguish between that. And then there's much more detailed, and this is where the citizen scientist or the amateur user of the website's local knowledge and their specific knowledge comes in handy. So they're asked to add in any of the species names that may come with the illustration. Sometimes it has nothing to do with the species, has nothing to do with plant or animal, and they won't fill anything in here. But this is particularly useful for BHL to create keyword searchable image for all different types of species. And we don't know whether that's going to be useful in the end, but hopefully it will be. Hopefully the end point is that BHL, you'll be able to type in a genus and species and be able to find all whatever the BHL has that has been citizen scientist records of that particular genus. After that, they're asked to add any kind of inscription that is in the image, and this is where the historical value comes in play. So this is actually not that common, but some illustrations you have notes that are made at the bottom of the illustration, or extra addendums to the illustration that are made, or inscriptions, any kind of different inscription that's given to the illustration, and that we want to capture what that is. More interestingly for me is the final section of what the citizen scientist is asked to do, and that's to give a description of who the people are, if they know it, making the illustration. So where usually right at the bottom here, as we saw in some of the other images, you'll get the name of Del Ad Nat, the illustrator, the person that drew the image itself, or the lithographer, the wood engraver, the printer, the photolithographer. So this is where they can add in, through a pinpoint function, the names of each of these individuals, and then give a category of whether they're engraver, illustrator, or whatnot. And then the final task is really, so all of these steps are both reliant on the knowledge of the citizen scientists themselves, but also any information which is circulated around the page. We've also created a function where they can click this button here, which is hard to see, but it's a little page, and that will bring them back to the original page on the BHL website. And then they can go backwards. So you can't actually scroll in any of these images here. You can zoom in and zoom out, but you can't go back and forward between pages because they're entirely randomized. But if you go to the BHL page, you can then go back and look on the previous page, which is often the case of where the description of the image would have been in the text. And a lot of the citizen scientists, actually, to my surprise, are doing this. They're going to the BHL page and they're looking. They're spending time to investigate what these images are and to give us as much metadata as we can. And then the final task really here is much less to do with the text and more to do with the skill and the knowledge of the observer themselves, where they can enter in any keywords. And really this is for the BHL most exclusively to be able to keyword search any of these images. So this is where people will put in shell or conchologist or anything randomly they think relates to the image. And that would be helpful as a keyword tag. Now, this is the task that they're given for each page. But what's really valuable and useful as both a historian and for citizen science to think about what citizen scientists as a modern practice is doing is that they're not just, this isn't the only thing they can do on the website. The other thing they can do is every time they have a page that's really interesting, or something that sparks interest, or they think is a new species, or a species that needs to be identified and talked about more specifically, they can bring that image directly to a talk page. So this is where we have a set of moderators, including the research scientists or research humanists, such as myself, and a number of people in the Biodiversity Heritage Library group who run the discussion groups. But as you'll see here, there's a group of pages, all of these images are things that the particular citizen scientists thought were interesting and wanted to bring to the talk function. And then they can add hashtags to correlate these to other things that they've found. So we have a large one to do with hashtag blank, which means that the page is useless, but that's useful for the BHL. We also have one for hashtag strut, which is an engraver, and hashtag ruffle. So we get the citizen scientists to start identifying in the pages how often, before I can even look at the metadata, how often someone like ruffle or strut are engraving, right? So the citizen scientists are actually doing historical research here. And then farther down, which you can't see, there's a number of different discussion threads, help functions, interesting things, and in a number of other different citizen sciences projects. This has been a place where the citizen scientists can actually produce interesting research themselves. So they can come together and discuss interesting things and actually produce new information that the researchers such as myself wouldn't have thought about or wouldn't have done in their own place. And sometimes they even publish that completely outside of the original researcher. Now, what actually happens to the images? So we haven't yet gotten to the point where we're analyzing the catch of images that we have, because we've only gone on for about 2 months. But as you'll see, it's a completely different way of analyzing these images than the type of analysis I'm doing in the earlier part of this talk. So this is how we get each illustrated page of the periodical, and it will have all of these lines identify a different user saying that there's a box around an illustration, and each of the different circles are the pinpoint functions. And then down farther on the page, we'll get all of the metadata having to do with keywords, genus, species, and information to do with the image itself, and being able to correlate that. And we can dump that into, I guess, different modeling programs to be able to see how often a particular species or idea comes up. I bored you long enough, and you're welcome to ask me as many questions as you like, but that is our project. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jeff. That was fantastic. Maybe there's a little bit of time for a few questions and discussion or comments or thoughts or points. I might just repeat the questions into this area rather than hand the microphone around. That's okay. This is record. The talks are archived.
I'll just put that up since that's
I think
fine.
Vlad was there first.
So, is it intentional? Why don't you use any algorithm of automatic recognition of image?
So why don't we use an algorithm to get rid of the blank pages? Well, we actually, very interestingly, as we were developing, so we had a beta test for the website, and during that beta test, we invited a number of different participants, actually, some from the Natural History Museum and a number from the Zooniverse platform itself. And during that, we had one particular user who was fairly heavy in a number of other projects develop her own algorithm for us just in her own time, because she was interested and because she thought it would be useful for us. And I'm sure that that algorithm is useful, and we might actually use it we might use something along those lines, or apply something along those lines to further uploads that we have. But the point is, or at least the point for both Zooniverse and for BHL, was that it's not actually that tedious to have an unillustrated page. So it's not that difficult for someone to just say, no, there's not an illustration on this page. while algorithms are trustworthy, they're not absolutely trustworthy. Whereas the set, if we have 5 citizen scientists saying that there's no illustration on a page, that is exclusively much more trustworthy than an algorithm. That's not to say we might not use it down the line, but right now, when we wanted to launch the project, having them wasn't a tedious aspect of it.
Basically, you didn't have time to do it.
No, it was an explicit decision. I mean, on our part, it was a decision that the algorithm isn't a necessity. I mean, it's not something that you can use an algorithm to get rid of things that are absolutely make the process of being a citizen scientist absolutely impossible. But this wasn't that case.
I had just a couple of quick ones. So how long did it take to get 4,000 users?
Well, this is just within 2 months.
Wow. Okay,
Yeah.
And what do you know anything about their demographic? Or
They have, yeah. Well, I mean, I couldn't say a lot about their demographic, but Zooniverse can. They have an incredible amount of information about their whole range of participants. They have over 1 million users that are registered on their website. So when they send out information, I mean, the interesting thing about it is that it's become, when they launch the project, you get a massive group of people going online, and that's actually where we got a good percentage of our first, within 3 weeks, we had over 100,000 or 120,000.
Do you have to pay Zooniverse?
No, they're actually they're one of our co-Is on the project. So they're actually a participating member of the constructing.
How do they raise funding to maintain
their
infrastructure?
They're all internal. It's all through the physics department, and they have their own internal funding. So they do all of these projects, not through. They're not paid projects. They do them all to develop the idea of citizen science through Zooniverse. And the goal is to be able to allow a whole range of, well, I mean, they've focused primarily on science, on various ranges of science first, but they're obviously getting into humanities. But the point is to be able to get to give analysis of large data sets to.
Where are they based?
University of Oxford. They're Chris Lintott, who's the co-investigator on the Constructing Scientific Communities project, is the director. Well, he started it in 2007.
Director of Zooniverse.
Director of Zooniverse, yeah.
Okay.
And he's one of the people that makes it go, I guess.
I think there was one other. Yeah.
Yeah, apologies if you asked this before.
No.
At the very last slide, you had all the boxes that he's done. So obviously each slide is done by multiple.
Yeah.
Each page is done by multiple people. Is it a set number? Do you say about 8?
Yes.
Would be a good number.
So we have a retire rate. It was started at 15, but now we've gone down to 10.
That's quite a lot of duplicated time. I didn't realise. I thought you would just trust one person.
No. The point of Zooniverse is that you trust a set of people. That it's only a data only becomes valuable if you can eliminate. Yeah, if you can replicate the results.
And why is the pages that a user can see randomized? Why do you not say, okay, let them see the whole thing? Let them see 20 pages at a time if they want to, and then they can follow it through. Why do they have to go to BHL to see?
Because the
Just repeat the question.
So why is it randomized? Part of that has to do with how Zooniverse have learned to create function for their website, and I think they've learned generally that a lot of their users don't just like randomized things. That's how they. So you can, one of the functions you can do is go to on this page is both a description page, but you can then also click on one of these and it will randomize within that periodical itself.
So if you come from Wiltshire, you're like, I really
Yes.
want the Wiltshire one.
Yeah. So the problem was that the capacity, the programming capacity of the website, they couldn't both create it randomized and sequential and period. So the best thing we could do is create a randomized general search function or general analysis function, and then a smaller randomized group of periodicals. But that we don't necessarily want also the user to go through from start to finish because they might also start creating a bias through that. I think is part of the answer.
I suspect the randomize is quite fun as well.
Yeah.
Have you ever done the random page in Wikipedia? It's actually really, it's quite addictive. It's quite, you end up with the most obscure and bizarre things. I suspect that probably is an attraction to the users.
I think so. I mean, a lot of people that's why the talk function is so important, because people just randomly come across really interesting stuff. And there's like blogs within Zooniverse itself, and there's something called the Daily Zoo, where they highlight something really interesting from each of the projects. or actually only one of the projects, and people can say this should go on Daily Zoo, and sometimes they have. We've already had about 3. Within the first week and a half, one of the citizen scientists found our background. The background image is from one of the periodicals, and they already found it within, I think, a week and a half or something like that.
Any other questions, or shall we retire upstairs for a cold drink? We've got some beer and some red wine and white wine. But I just want to, just to start, really appreciate that, Jeff. Really fascinating, really interesting. I guess in this sort of modern science world of under pressure to get a grant overhead and do cure for cancer and climate change, these sort of things, I personally find it really inspirational, and it shows also how much the public are really fascinated by the minutiae and intricacies of scientific working and how scientists work and the illustrations and the history of it as well. I think that's really great. So let's just thank Jeff once again, and then pop upstairs. Darwin Centre, 8th floor common room. See you up there for a cold drink. Okay, thanks, Jeff.